Okay, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you for the warm introduction as well. It is a great honor and pleasure to be speaking today as recipient of the 2021 Toshihide Numata Award. As has already been pointed out, it is no longer 2021, nor is it 2022. My monograph was completed in the earliest months of the pandemic, in the middle of 2020. Completing the editorial process under those conditions was not very pleasant. By the time the book was finished, I thought maybe its release would go unnoticed, as colleagues the world over continued to wrestle with any number of problems. The problems in particular of organizing, teaching at universities and colleges online, and this to say nothing of the many other challenges that we faced during the pandemic. This was a turbulent time that was, of course, marked by great loss, including the loss of colleagues and of notable scholars in our field. Just one that I will name now is David Seyfort-Rouet, a significant figure in the study of the particular literature on which I work, who we lost during this period. Another colleague lost to us far too early was one of my doctoral supervisors, the Numata professor of Buddhist studies at Oxford, Stefano Zecchetti, and I dedicate this paper to his memory. The book was released under the conditions of a more or less global lockdown, and I would be fascinated to know precisely how many physical copies of the book were picked up and read during this time. It was, however, clearly read, maybe mostly in electronic form, and to my surprise, very well received. And I will repeat my thanks again today to the panel of the Toshihide Numata Prize, and of course, again to the Bokyo Dendo Kyokai, both for its recognition of my work, but moreover, of course, for its continuing efforts to support the study of Buddhism in all of its many and varied forms the world over. Before I talk further about the book and my work on its themes since its release, I'd like to acknowledge some colleagues whose work and support has been particularly important. This will involve also some reference to texts and themes that I will explain only in more detail a little later. The literature on which I've worked is of particular interest in Japanese academia, and so it's unsurprising that I owe thanks to several esteemed colleagues here. I owe a debt to Professor Shimoda Masahiro, whose landmark work on the Mahaparinirvana Mahasutra, or the Nihangyo or Nippanshin, what I will mostly call the Nirvana Sutra. This work of Professor Shimoda provided important foundations for my work and that of many others since. I owe thanks also to Professor Habata Hiromi, whose work on especially the Sanskrit and Tibetan versions of this sutra has been invaluable for all who have worked on it since. I owe thanks also to Kano Kazo, especially for his methodical work on the Angulimala Sutra, and other scholars including Suzuki Takeyasu, one of the few colleagues to have spent time working on the Mahabodhi Sutra. Outside of Japan, scholars working on what we might call Buddha nature literature, indeed Mahayana literature more broadly, can look to Mikhail Zimmerman's treatment of the Tathagata Sutra as an exemplary study of an Indian text and different forms of it. Zimmerman's early approval of my work after my doctoral thesis was a great encouragement in the first years of my career. I owe also a debt to work by Stephen Hodge, who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, who did important work on the Nirvana Sutra as well. It's also very obvious for those who've read my work that I owe a debt to Michael Radich. The completion of my doctorate, dealing with many of the texts discussed also in my book, was completed around the same time as Professor Radich published his arguably revolutionary study of the Mahaparinirvana Mahasutra or Nirvana Sutra, in which Radich demonstrated that this text is perhaps still more important in the history of teaching about Buddha nature than had previously been appreciated. It was with great relief that I discovered Michael's work neither contradicted nor corrected my own, but rather complemented it. I found that what I was seeing in the wider Buddha nature literature made great sense with Michael's hypotheses about the earlier stages of this tradition were correct. Whether or not all of these colleagues or others agree with my presentation of Tathagata or Buddha nature literature, I thank them all for the roles that they have played in the production of my monograph and in my work since. I count myself especially lucky to be working in a very dynamic period in the history of scholarship. Okay. Well, I can do now.
Yes.
Okay.
I have already said.
Okay. Okay. No. As I was saying, I count myself especially lucky to be working in a particularly dynamic period in the history of scholarship dealing with this curious corner of Buddhist religious history. That is, teaching about Buddha nature, or the idea that the exalted status of a Buddha is not so remote as it may otherwise seem to be. What is the monograph in question about? In the early stages of my research on Buddha nature literature, my aim was to trace the challenging relationship in Indian texts between the term Tathagata, that is integral to Indian teaching about what we may call Buddha nature, and the notion of an enduring self or Atman. This obviously entailed a lot of reflection on the term Tathagata, an expression used in different ways across Mahayana Buddhist sources, and what ties together its different usages across Mahayanist literature. What helped was to have in mind a distinction between the use of the term Tathagata and a sense of an idea or perhaps family of ideas with which it was related. For want of a better term, I continue to call this simply the Buddha nature idea or perhaps Buddha nature teaching. This is the idea that all sentient beings at all times and across successive lives possess already the characteristics or qualities of a Buddha. And I keep this working definition, which I certainly bring to my sources, deliberately very broad or vague for reasons that will become clearer shortly. This idea is often, but by no means necessarily, taught using the expressions Tathagata or Buddha Dhatu. Buddha nature teaching is an innovation in Mahayana Buddhist thought that we find preserved in several texts produced in the early centuries of the Common Era. By no means does it belong to the earliest phases of the development of the Indian Mahayana. But during what seems to be the astoundingly productive period in the life of this tradition between roughly the 2nd and 4th centuries. Teaching about Buddha nature stands out in Buddhist doctrinal history because it invites new kinds of comparisons with wider Indian religious thought and philosophy. It has at very least superficial resemblance to ideas prominent in Brahmanism, later what we call Hinduism, as well as in Jainism and other traditions in India now lost to us. In short, the concept of Buddha nature invites easy comparison to the notion that there is something enduring and precious in each of us, something that neither changes nor ceases, which in Sanskrit might be worthy of the label Atman. Buddhism, from perhaps its earliest phases of development, was famously critical of wider Indian interest in the notion of Atman. Buddhism opposed fixation with the notion of an enduring self and the search for it. As critics, classical and modern, have argued, teaching about Buddha nature may constitute some innovators in Mahayanist thinking crossing an important doctrinal boundary or breaking some conceptual taboo. They promoted the idea that the Buddha taught something that at least resembles an account of an enduring self, and that liberation is a process not of transformation, but of self-discovery. In my work, I sought to explore the literary history of the term Tathagata and its relationship to discourse about selfhood, in Sanskrit what we might call Atmavada. This was my aim, but as my work developed, I found myself having more to say about the likely evolution of Buddha nature teaching beyond just that one concern. I found that an exploration of how the expression Tathagata relates to discourse about selfhood was in fact an exploration of the development of Buddha nature teaching in India as such. This built upon recent study of other texts or various texts in this tradition, Zimmerman on the Tathagata Sutra, Shimoda, Habata, and Radich on the Mahaparinirvana, Kano on the Angulimala and Ratnapratiprabhaga, Jonathan Silk on the Ananapa Aparanapa Nidesha, and others besides. In what follows, I will outline some of the arguments of my book concerning the development of this influential but also contentious tradition in Mahayana Buddhism. I should stress that my focus throughout is on the Indian context for our sources and the ideas that they preserve, but I will make some reference to the transmission of these texts and concepts outside of India into Chinese and Tibetan intellectual circles as well. I'm going to present something of a potted account of what the book explores, and in the closing minutes, I will offer some work in progress concerning a text that I do not consider to have been directly concerned with the term Tathagata, but which I've come to believe offers insights into the still earlier life of thinking about Buddha nature as a broader idea, prior perhaps to the invention of the term Tathagata. Before venturing further, we should look closer again at the key terminology under discussion. Many here, I'm sure, are well acquainted with the terms and concepts central to teaching about Buddha nature, but we should still reflect on the language used by this corner of Indian Mahayana Buddhism in the early centuries of the Common Era. First, we have the enigmatic term Tathagata, and this permits no single definitive definition. The reference of the first part of this compound is obvious enough. The Tathagata is the thus gone one or thus come one. Some colleagues use the transcendent one. And of course, this is an epithet of the Buddha. In some Sanskrit texts, we find Buddha-garba as a reassurance. Tathagata-garba means Buddha-garba. But what does this mean? The second component of the compound, garba, is no doubt trickier. The term garba means either a womb or an embryo. And to every student of this tradition, this is the first confusing aspect. We have a term that can refer on the one hand to the container or chamber or source for something precious. And on the other hand, it can refer to the precious entity that some container or chamber holds. One could argue that these divergent interpretations of the term garba are represented by the established translations of Tathagata in Chinese and Tibetan. The Chinese rendering, as Rulai Zhang, clearly understands this term to mean the chamber for or of a Buddha. Zhang means not so obviously a womb, but a storehouse or holder or chamber. Meanwhile, the Tibetan tradition translates Desin Shekne Ningpo, in which Ningpo means an essence or the core or heart of something. And this looks to have understood garba more in the sense of an embryo, something precious that is housed or kept hidden. So does Tathagata refer to the womb of or for a Buddha, or is it the presence of the embryo of or for a Buddha? It can mean either or both, as reception of the term outside of India suggests. My own reading of our sources, however, suggests that the Chinese rendering of the term more likely captures what our earliest Indian authors were trying to say. My preferred rendering of Tathagata into English is chamber for a Buddha. This is consistent with the two ways the term is used in Indic sources. In some cases, for example, in the Ratnabhojika Varga, and it seems the Tathagata Sutra, the term Tathagata is a Bhagavad compound. It describes sentient beings. They are chambers for a Buddha, by which is meant that they themselves house a Buddha, or what is proper to a Buddha in themselves. And we see this in the Sanskrit of this present slide. Sarvasattvas Tathagata. Elsewhere, though, and in fact more frequently, things seem harder to clarify. More often, Tathagata does not qualify sentient beings, but something that they possess or harbor. Beings have Tathagata. And we see this again in some examples of Sanskrit here, where we have Tathagata Visti. This is also very common in Chinese translation, where you see, for example, here, Yo Rulai Zhang. There is the presence of Tathagata. So this is now a fixed term for the presence of something. Still, I think the chamber for a Buddha, a hidden space at which a Buddha is present or resides. There is another term in our key texts in this tradition that is often used interchangeably with Tathagata, and I think this helps to clarify what is going on. This term is Buddha Dhatu, which, unlike Tathagata, can be fairly accurately and simply rendered into English as Buddha nature. The Sanskrit dhatu denotes an essence or nature of something. It is the basic element or source of something. Dhatu can refer to precious metal in Sanskrit that requires extraction from a naturally occurring ore. Dhatu is also a linguistic term. It can mean the verbal root that is the essence of any expression. So the Sanskrit root kri is the dhatu of the noun karma or of the verb forms karomi or krita. Hence, the dhatu of the Buddha is the essence of a Buddha. And this term evokes also the Buddhist cult of relics. The Buddha's dhatu is also his bodily essence, that is believed to have survived the fire of his cremation, and which Indian Buddhism took to reside at any stupa. This is a dimension of the term to which I'll return later. Buddhadhatu was commonly rendered Fotsing in Chinese, which invites association with older and wider East Asian interest in the term Tsing. And Buddhadhatu was rendered with Sangegi Kam or Sangegi Yin in Tibetan. This is somewhat misleading. It uses Tibetan terms that would translate another sense of the Sanskrit dhatu, meaning realm or expanse. This is what is understood where Chinese translators would more commonly use the term Jie. Again, in Indian literature, we find Buddhadhatu referring to something that sentient beings have, as we see in the examples in this present slide. The history of these two terms, Tathagatagarbha and Buddhadhatu, is clearly intertwined. They are both used by Indian Buddhist authors to refer to the presence of something extraordinary in the constitution of every sentient being. These terms denote the hidden presence of a Buddha, and what is most essential to a Buddha in all of us at all times. But if we look at our relevant sources concerned with this terminology, we find lots of different ideas regarding to what they refer. And we'll approach this focusing on the more well-known and better remembered of these two expressions, that is, Tathagatagarbha. Another important work that prefigures my own, and still the most thorough and in-depth study of literature concerned with Tathagatagarbha, is by the great Takasaki Jikido. This is his Nyoraiso Shiso no Kese, which the author translated as Formation of the Tathagatagarbha Theory. In this slide, I'm showing how Takasaki grouped together what he took to be the most relevant works of this tradition, all of which we can be confident were produced in India in roughly the first 4 centuries of the Common Era. For Takasaki, of foremost importance are what he presented as the triple scriptures of this tradition. These are the Tathagatagarbha Sutra, taken by Takasaki and others to have been the earliest text in this tradition, the Anunatva Aparnatva Nidesha, a philosophically sophisticated text that survives in just one complete Chinese translation, and the Shramala Devi Simhanada Sutra, which I will henceforth call just the Shramala Devi. And this, if we follow the Indian commentarial tradition, has a good claim to be the most influential text on the slide. Why did Takasaki privilege these texts? In part, he did so because it is these 3 that are the major sources for a commentarial work produced in the 4th or 5th century, the Ratnagojavibhaga, which for Takasaki and other scholars provided something like a lens through which this difficult literature and its history could be better understood. It's undoubtedly through the lens of the Ratnagojavibhaga that Tibetan commentators of later centuries made sense of teaching about Buddha nature and how to understand the term Tathagatagarbha. Aside from these texts, there are works that use the term Tathagatagarbha but privilege also Buddhadhatu, used interchangeably with it. And these sutra texts, Takasaki considered to be important, but crucially something of a separate or divergent literary tradition. These works include the Mahaparinirvana Mahasutra, or commonly just Nirvana Sutra, which is a strong contender for most important Indian Buddhist work in China, alongside the Lotus Sutra, a text with which it has a great deal in common. With the Nirvana Sutra are grouped 3 lesser-known, lesser-studied discourses: the Angulimala Sutra, the Mahaberi Sutra or Mahaberiharika Sutra, and, quite a long name, the Bodhisattva Gotra Paya Vishya Vikarvana Nidesha Sutra, which we know from Indian sources had a more manageable title as well, the Satyaka Parivarta. The first 3 of these works listed here share a great deal in common with respect to how they present teachings about Tathagatagarbha. The 3 works explicitly teach that the nature of a Buddha, present at all times in all sentient beings, is the Buddha's revelation of what could be called the self or Atman. And importantly, this is not simply implied when the Buddha reveals that all beings have Buddha nature. According to these texts, Buddha nature is the self. The exclusion of these works from the content of the Ratnagojavibhaga suggested to Takasaki that they were not the main current of teaching about Tathagatagarbha in India. An examination of their doctrine, which openly courted controversy by declaring Buddha nature to be an account of the self, may help to explain why these texts were omitted. In the Nirvana Sutra, the Angulimala and Mahaberi in particular, we are in unusual doctrinal territory, and it does not appear that Indian Buddhism of later centuries gave much attention to these texts. Takasaki acknowledged 2 more works, that he took to have some role in the development of the term Tathagata, in which he understood there to be an association between this and broader Buddhist teaching about the lineage or heritage of Gotra or a Buddha in all sentient beings. The works in question are the Mahamegha Sutra, the subject of a number of studies and a focus of my current work, and the Mahayana Dashadarmaka Sutra, which to my knowledge has received less scholarly attention. So this slide tells us what Takasaki understood to be all of those works in India relevant to the development of the term Tathagata. As he devoted great attention to each, he nonetheless definitely privileged some works over others, a point to which I'll return in a moment. But as scholars of Indian Buddhist texts know, there is seldom, if ever, one text by any given name. The fact that we have multiple witnesses to the life of any literary work, which exhibits sometimes subtle, sometimes profound differences, must be kept in mind at all times. And another complication is that in the case of much Mahayanist literature, we do not often have any extant witness to an Indic version of a text. That is, we have no surviving source in Sanskrit or another Indic language like it. So we are compelled to study texts through Chinese and Tibetan translations. We do this in the hope of someday finding some Sanskrit text, but we know that this will likely not be an early witness to the life of a work, as might better be seen through a Chinese translation quite often from the early centuries of the Qing era. So, for example, when reading the Shamala Devi, this is not reading one particular source. It means looking at the Sanskrit fragments of the text, both in the Shoyen collection, carefully edited by Matsuda Kazunobu, but then also quotations of the Shamala Devi in the Ratnakotavibhaga. It means looking then at two different Chinese translations of the text, by Gunabhadra in the 5th century and Bodhiruchi in the 8th, and then the Tibetan version of the text from the 9th century, translated by the team of Yeshede, Jinamitra, and Surendra Bodhi. So now in the current slide are the relevant sources for an investigation of the expression Tathagata, at least if we still follow Takasaki's sense of what these sources are. I have marked here with an S every Sanskrit source, C every Chinese source, and T every Tibetan source. But a closer inspection of these sources shows that perhaps not all of them are worthy of our attention. To my mind, in order for a source to be an important witness to the story of the evolution of Tathagata, that text must be doing more than just mentioning the term. So we ask, what are the sources here that actually discuss the term Tathagata? What sources tell us anything about what our authors intended by it? And another concern is about Indian provenance. When dealing with content that survives just in one source and not in an Indic language, can we be sure that we are dealing with material that has a South Asian origin? So in this slide, I've colored in red those sources that give any kind of account of to what Tathagata refers or what it means. Some things here, as you will see, are not in red. They do not tell us anything. These sources mention the term Tathagata, perhaps, but that is all. And there are other works in Indian Buddhism that use the term, but again, don't tell us anything about it. For example, in extant Sanskrit of the Buddhavatamsaka or in the Ganavyuha Sutra. A curiosity you'll see here is that only one witness to the Satyaka Parivarta, or Bodhisattva Gotra Payavishya Vikurvana, talks at all about Tathagata. This is demonstrably a late addition to just one version of this work, and what we find there is not very illuminating. Another thing to note is that one of our most important and studied sources here, the Nirvana Sutra, has a particularly complex textual history. I have marked with a star one of our two Chinese translations. This is Damak Shema's version of the text from the early 5th century, which is 4 times as long as any other version. This, the Nipan Jing, is arguably the most important text concerned with Buddha nature in East Asia, but 3/4 of its content may not be a simple translation from India, and the teachings of this content go beyond and sometimes depart from what we know to have been taught in the main content of the Nirvana Sutra from India. That extra material in the Nirvana Sutra is by no means irrelevant in this story, but it does need to be handled as something separate from the rest of this text and the rest of the sources for Buddha nature teaching that we can be more confident developed in India. So in my work, I took these texts, these sources, to be primary, albeit with an important further addition. A text that Takasaki omitted from his discussion of Tathagata, at least in its early life, is the Lankavatara Sutra. This is because this well-known sutra does not put teaching about Buddha nature front and center. Instead, it reduces Tathagata to an epithet of the substratum consciousness, or Alaya Vijnana, as taught by the Yogacara Vijnanavada school. But importantly, the Lankavatara Sutra meets my criterion for a Tathagata text. It gives us an account of to what the term refers and explains its usage to an audience. The Lankavatara demonstrates knowledge of earlier works concerned with Tathagata. For example, it teaches that this is not the Buddha's account of what should be called a self, though the Buddha had discussed it in those terms, but just for the benefit of converting non-Buddhists. It even mentions by name several of the other texts here, the Nirvana Sutra, the Angulimala Sutra, and Srimala Devi. So the Lankavatara Sutra sits relatively late in the history of this tradition, but at an important juncture. It shows appropriation of teaching about Tathagata into Yogacara Vijnanavada systematics, and it takes what is conceptually useful about this term and for what it stands, while challenging its earlier heritage in association with ideas of selfhood. These sutras in the slide exhibit different usages of the term Tathagata. In every case, the expression has something to do with what I've called the Buddha nature idea, that all sentient beings at all times have already the character or qualities of a Buddha. The term Tathagata is used to teach one or other form of this idea, but clearly there are different ways of understanding that all sentient beings have the nature of a Buddha. Teasing out these differences was a key aim of my work in my monograph. In this slide are some of the different features of what deserve to be considered true Tathagata texts. The unifying feature is some investment in the term Tathagata and some idea about Buddha nature. But there are different features and themes of these texts that reveal important differences between them. The first two I've discussed already. There's the important distinction between Tathagata as a referent for sentient beings themselves, visible in the Tathagata Sutra, and then works in which Tathagata is something distinct that sentient beings all have. And the latter, I should stress, is the prevailing use of the term. Then there is use of the term Buddha-dhatu in proximity to Tathagata. This is found in the Nirvana Sutra, the Angulimala Sutra, and Mahabodhi Sutra, but also, very curiously, in what looks to be early content in the composition of the Ratnabhutta. Other influential works here, the Tathagata Sutra and Srimala Devi, have no interest in the term Buddha-dhatu at all. Those works that do not have an interest in the term Buddha-dhatu are those that instead relate to Tathagata to a different idea, which we find in other Mahayanist works besides. This is the notion of an intrinsically pure or intrinsically luminous mind, prakriti parishuddha chitta or prakriti pavasvara chitta. This is a prominent idea in the Srimala Devi, the Ananatva Atmanatma Nidesha, Ratnabhutta and Lankavatara Sutra. I argue in my monograph that this is a marginally later usage of the term Tathagata, wedded with Buddhist teachings about the mind, its nature, and strata. And this is noticeably absent from works including the Nirvana Sutra. Across all of these works, albeit explored differently, is the sense that Tathagata gestures towards something greater than what we seem to be, something transcendent, the true and enduring mode of a Buddha's being or his Dharmakaya. This idea is found clearly in the Srimala Devi, Ananatva Apranatva Nidesha, and Ratnabhutta. It is found also in works like the Nirvana Sutra, but in a fashion that I think seems less developed. Finally, we come to the feature of these texts that drew me to them in the first place. Works of this tradition take different approaches to how far teaching about Tathagata could or should be understood as the Buddha's account of the self or Atma. They thereby also take different stances with respect to how teaching about Tathagata relates to an older theme in Buddhist doctrine, teaching about non-self or anatma. Determining the relevant sources for this study, we do need to presume something of a starting point. If we're tracing the development of Tathagata literature in India, we should have some sense of where this begins. Following Takasaki, the scholarly consensus over the last 50 or so years was that the Tathagata Sutra is the likely earliest Indian source concerned with teaching about Tathagata. But Michael Zimmerman's landmark study of the text in 2002 introduced an element of doubt. Zimmerman noticed that the text was structured in a fashion such that the core material of the Tathagata Sutra, a series of evocative similes about Buddha nature, barely made any mention of the term Tathagata. It is an integral term to the framing of the text, but what looks to be its earliest content concerns instead the broad idea of Buddha nature, that the character or qualities of a Buddha are immanent, but without using the term Tathagata. In this and some other regards, the Tathagata Sutra may be something of an outlier in this corpus of texts. So perhaps the oldest usage of Tathagata comes from somewhere else. This brings us to Michael Radich's study of a different text, that is the Nirvana Sutra, in full what is now being called the Mahaparinirvana Mahasutra. Again, Takasaki took this to be part of a second stream of teaching about Tathagata in India. Radich proposes, however, that in fact the Nirvana Sutra may be the earliest text in this tradition, or at least preserving the earliest usage of the term Tathagata. And I found his hypothesis convincing, both on its own terms, as outlined in Radich's 2015 monograph, but also because this supports what I find looking at the rest of this literature. I find that most texts of this tradition know or exhibit some influence by the Nirvana Sutra. They either accept and develop its account of Buddha nature or depart from it, showing some awareness of its ideas. Discussing the provenance of the Nirvana Sutra relative to our other texts would take a long time. So I will instead just sketch out one very elegant aspect of Radich's argument for the positioning of this text early in the life of the term Tathagata. Radich's study of the Nirvana Sutra is a rich and sophisticated account of its content, this of a text produced in the very earliest centuries of the Common Era. We benefit from my summarizing just briefly what I think is the kernel of Radich's hypothesis, that the narrative content of this text, a Mahayana account of the final days and teachings of Buddha Shakyamuni, provides a persuasive scenario of origin for the earliest use of the term Tathagata. As argued already by Shimoda Masahiro, the Nirvana Sutra seems to have been composed in at least 2 stages, or perhaps more. Earlier content of the text befits its title. The established Mahaparinirvana narrative, of course, sees the Buddha on his deathbed, revealing that he soon will die. We find this in mainstream Buddhist texts, for example, the Pali Mahaparinirvana Sutta. But in this Mahayanist retelling of the story, the episode is turned on its head. The Buddha reveals that in fact he does not truly die, that his true mode of being is beyond the flesh and blood body that his disciples see. So in short, the Mahayana Nirvana Sutra is first a story of the Buddha's death, in which the fact of his death is reimagined. The second phase of the text sees the Buddha introduce the fact that all sentient beings possess Buddha Dhatu, or possess Tathagata. The traditional Mahaparinirvana narrative, we must remember, does not end with the Buddha's death. The Buddha dies and is cremated, but then what remains of his body, called his Dhatus, are distributed across India, enshrined then in stupas. The Buddha dies, but then the precious remnants of his person are relocated across the world for the benefit of sentient beings everywhere. In this Mahayana reimagining of the Buddha's final days, we again find an account of what is essential to a Buddha, the Buddha Dhatus, but this time these traces of a Buddha are not physical remnants distributed across the landscape, but they are said to be present in every sentient being. They are present at what is called one's Tathagata. And another term for a stupa, attested in Buddhist literature and epigraphy, is Tathagata Dhatu Garbha, the chamber for the essence of a Buddha. So the Nirvana Sutra is an account of the Buddha's death in which he does not truly die, and an account of the location of the essence of a Buddha, in which this is revealed to be present in all sentient beings. This evokes the stupa cult, where it declares that all sentient beings possess Tathagata Garbha. And indeed, in its lines, the Nirvana Sutra says that bodhisattvas should think of themselves as like stupas, as worthwhile objects of reverence and merit-making for everyone in the world. So I'm persuaded that the Nirvana Sutra may be our earliest Indian source to promote the notion that all beings possess Tathagata Garbha. This, even if the idea of Buddha nature perhaps had a still more complicated history. If we indeed take the Nirvana Sutra as the earliest source to present an account of Tathagata Garbha, then we must take very seriously how it talks about this term and how it presents it to its audience. Together with the Angulimala Sutra and Mahabharata Sutra, the Nirvana Sutra explicitly and emphatically declares that what the Buddha calls Tathagata Garbha, hidden in the constitution of every sentient being, is nothing less than the Buddha's account of the self. And this slide is a very direct assertion of this. What is called the self is the Tathagata Garbha. The nature of the Buddha exists in every sentient being, but because it is obscured by all manner of afflictions, sentient beings cannot see within themselves its presence. Buddha nature is there in all sentient beings. It is equivalent to the presence of a thing called Tathagata Garbha. We can understand this to mean the chamber or space at which a Buddha is present, the place at which the nature of a Buddha is kept hidden, and it deserves to be called Atman. And I probably don't need to point out how radical this is. Evidence suggests that from the late Vedic period onwards, Indian religious authors were greatly invested in the notion of Atman, or what is enduring and valuable in the constitution of any sentient being. Such a thing would quite often be imagined as the agent of deeds, that is of karma, and the individual that undergoes the seemingly endless process of death, rebirth, and further suffering in transmigration, that is samsara. For Brahminic authors, such as those responsible for the early Upanishads, knowledge of the self was a necessity if one were to escape this process. For renunciant traditions other than Buddhism, such as early Jainism, knowing the difference between what is oneself and what is not is realizing that which can be liberated and that which is just contingent. If transmigration is a fact, as most Indian traditions accepted, then surely it was vital to know, and then work to liberate, what one properly is, that is, oneself or Atman. Forms of discourse concerned with notions of the self, following Buddhist tradition in India, I refer to as Atmavada, that is, discourse or discourses about the self. And this means not just teaching one idea about the self, but rather discourse that makes central the importance of knowing and finding what one truly is. Early Buddhism proposed an alternative. Early discourses, for example, the Pali Anattalakkhana Sutta, see the Buddha undermine the position that anything in our experience deserves to be thought of as the self. And if there is nothing in my physicality or in my mental life that endures, what can possibly be there that meets the criteria for an enduring self? And then what is there worth clinging to? Surely what is more important is the cultivation of one's character or the transformation of oneself in the direction of virtue without craving or attachment, and that would lead to alleviation from rebirth. Buddhism developed ideas about transmigration that had no need for the notion of an enduring essence or kernel to one's character. This was done primarily through forms of teaching about dependent origination, or pratitya-samutpada. Transmigration is constituted by moments of experience, each impermanent and dependent solely upon others for their existence. In the beginningless, seemingly endless flow of experience across one life and successive lives, there is then no need for a notion of an enduring self, and to search for such a thing would be futile. Buddhist philosophers went on to explore this commitment to not teaching about a self in different ways. And I refer to this Buddhist commitment to Nairatmyavada, or discourse about absence of self, or discourse that opposes a notion of an enduring self. This is Buddhist teaching that has just no need or interest in such a thing as a permanent, precious kernel of our identity. But now in the early centuries of the Common Era, in this strange corner of Mahayana Buddhist teaching, things change. In the Nirvana Sutra and related works, the Buddha reveals that what he calls Tathagata Garbha, or Buddha Dhatu, or the presence of a Buddha's nature in all sentient beings, deserves to be called the self. Other notions of selfhood that one may encounter in the world are deficient or inaccurate. None of the ideas found in, for example, the Brahminic Upanishads successfully communicate in full what is enduring about us or precious within us. But here in the Buddha's revelation of Buddha nature, we are finally introduced to what we really, truly, always are. Consider this further quotation, again from the Nirvana Sutra. Sentient beings, being of the world, do not know the reality of the self. They are influenced by bad companions and ignorant of the Buddha's use of cryptic utterances, so that while the self indeed exists, they mentally cultivate only absence of self. Buddha nature or the self is otherworldly and can be known only by a Buddha. It has been taught by the Buddha through the use of what the text describes as cryptic utterances sometimes, that is, speech acts that intend ideas about Buddha nature but do not make this transparent. First and most important, according to the Buddha, is getting rid of false notions of the self. But then, in higher teachings of the Mahayana, one can begin to appreciate what is the self, that is our Buddha nature. The Buddha's earlier followers successfully distance themselves from erroneous notions of selfhood and cultivate ideas about absence of self. But what they then must do is understand Tathagata. They must internalize the fact that they do in fact possess something worthy of being called the self that has always been hidden within themselves, the nature of a Buddha. If this is not shocking and controversial enough, consider this final quotation, now from the Mahabodhi Sutra, a work closely related to the Nirvana Sutra. This goes further when it argues that there must be something worthy of being called the self in order for Buddhist soteriology to make any sense. The Tathagata is a god among gods. If parinirvana is complete annihilation, the world will be gradually destroyed as different beings achieve it. If it is not annihilation, then it is lasting and tranquil. Since parinirvana is lasting and tranquil, as the text keeps telling us, then certainly there exists a self, just as smoke means there is fire. To my mind, we could not be further from earlier Buddhist teaching about anatta. In this curious corner of Mahayana Buddhism, the Buddha proposes an account of the self. In this same text, we read that teachings about emptiness are incomplete and mean nothing unless one knows about Buddha nature. This is the true self realized in full only by Buddhas, which when it is liberated from bondage to transmigration, enjoys
Here's the cons and walnuts.
perfect
And
freedom
sprout or with a shell.
and
There is no
sovereignty.
nut that Tony does not sell. Tony sells his nuts all day. He always has a line.
Why did some Mahayana Buddhist authors depart from commitment to
Their
learning
vows.
from Buddha?
Tony lives his chocolate nuts. Mom will take them home and suck on them tonight. Yushin looks at Tony's nuts and tries hard not to stare. And Stephen grabs it.
Why our authors adopted a form of Atmavada, or discourse about the self, is one of the great mysteries in the early text of this tradition. And I will not today go into too much depth regarding this, but I will offer a sketch of my thoughts. These Mahayana sources acknowledge wider Indian interest in the notion of selfhood. Take this further passage from the Nirvana Sutra in this slide. The Buddha mentions images regarding the self that are found in some Upanishadic sources. This feature of the text has long been recognized by scholarship. But what I think is significant is that the imagery used by these authors resembles most closely what we find in what are called middle period Upanishads. That is not the sources, sources that scholars of Brahminic tradition associate with the centuries either side of the year zero, not sources from the late Vedic period that would have been known to our earliest Buddhist authors. There are two passages here reminiscent of the language of the Nirvana Sutra. These are from the Shvetasvatara Upanishad and the Katha Upanishad. These works post-date our earlier Buddhist sources that rejected discourse about the self. And arguably, Brahminic ideas about selfhood in these are different to what we find in other Upanishads. Brahminic thinking developed and changed. And here I say nothing about what we find in other interesting sources, like the Bhagavad Gita, another work from this same era, that reminds us again that Brahminic thought about the self was not static. Also in the early Common Era, we find Brahminic tradition espousing discourse about the self as something of superlative importance for a broad audience. It is not just for renouncers, but for kings also. The final passage here is from the Madhava Dharma Shastra, or Manusmriti, from perhaps the 2nd century. Here we find that Brahmins should be teaching kings about the science of the self, or Atma Vidya. And this implies that discourse about selfhood, about what we truly are, had a wide appeal. I think we should imagine that the early centuries of the Common Era were a period in which wider discourse about the self was a different kind of intellectual commodity to what it was in earlier centuries. It was something that Brahmins and others in India continued to reflect upon, but was now introduced to kings and other patrons as something about which Brahmins had special insight. In this environment, we find our Buddhist authors presenting, we might say marketing, the Buddha's own account of what could be called the self. In this corner of the Mahayana, Buddhists pick up a kind of philosophical discourse that they had long eschewed, and equip themselves with the Buddha's own account of what Brahmins especially were presenting as the highest of all things that one could know. I do not mean to reduce the origins of early Buddha nature teaching to this fact, but I suspect that the deliberate choice of the language of selfhood in the Nirvana Sutra and related sources was in part economic in the broadest sense of the word. It was motivated by a desire to appeal to what interested a large and potentially powerful audience. In Buddha nature teaching, Buddhist authors market their own account of the self. This is not how other Buddhist texts in this tradition present what is meant by Tathagata. As already mentioned, the Shamala Devi is a text cited by many later Buddhist commentators. Building on the suspicion by authors including Takasaki, Shimoda, and Radich, I argue that the Shamala Devi is at least in part a response to earlier teaching about Buddha nature. I would go so far as to say that it redeploys, maybe reinvents the term Tathagata to refer to something different to what we have seen in our other earlier sutras. It salvages the term Tathagata from contentious association with discourse about selfhood. There is this first important clarification. Bhagavan, or exalted one, the Tathagata is no self, no sentient being, no life principle, no enduring person. It is not within the domain of sentient beings who have fallen into the view of a worldly self, who have distorted views, who are bewildered by emptiness. The Nirvana Sutra would agree with this also, insofar as Tathagata is not an erroneous notion of selfhood, but it would then also say that Buddha nature is the true self. But the Shamala Devi states simply and emphatically that any thoughts about selfhood with respect to Tathagata are misplaced. Instead, it says this: the Tathagata is permanent and unchanging. Hence, it is the basis, the support, the foundation. Exalted one, this is not separate nor apart from, nor other nor different to, the inconceivable qualities of a Buddha. The Tathagata is the basis, support, and foundation that is separate to, apart from, different to, outside of conditioned phenomena. In the Shamala Devi, Tathagata is made something like a foundational principle, something that lies beneath our experience of transmigration and of liberation. The notion of something lying beneath our experience is not so reminiscent of wider Indian thinking about selfhood. It is, in fact, I think, very different to wider Indian discourse about Atman, at least to my knowledge. The Shamala Devi, I think, has taken the term Tathagata and employed it to refer to something more acceptable or more palatable for a wider Mahayana audience. Elsewhere, the Shamala Devi associates this with the intrinsic purity of the mind. Again, this is not something that we find in the Nirvana Sutra or other works related to it. I cannot today cover all of the supporting evidence for my claim, but it looks like the Shamala Devi is a respondent to earlier Buddhist teaching about Tathagata, in which that expression was used with reference, first of all, to an account of self. As far as the Shamala Devi is concerned, Tathagata is nothing like an account of the self, but another way of talking about the mind as the foundation for transmigration and liberation from it. Similar is found in the Ananapa Apanatha Nidesha and in the Ratnagotipavada, two works that develop ideas from the Shamala Devi. A final text that does this is the Lankavatara Sutra, which remembers still the early life of this tradition. As already mentioned, the Lankavatara Sutra subsumes what is meant by Tathagata into Yogacara Vijnanavada systematics. It declares that Tathagata is just another way of talking about the substratum consciousness. But it also knows and reflects upon the fact that the Buddha had earlier used the term Tathagata to teach something like an account of himself. The Tathagatas teach the Tathagata for the sake of those whose minds have fallen into the false view of an unreal self. That is not similar to the view of the self that belongs to non-Buddhist teachers. This is recognition that teachings about Tathagata were for a special purpose, for those audiences that needed something like a teaching about the self. But in the end, this does not refer to such a thing. This is a long way from the claim in the Nirvana Sutra that the Buddha, by teaching Tathagata, finally reveals what is the true account of the self, what does endure in our character, hidden from view, unlike so many wrong ideas about selfhood found in the world otherwise. To summarize, most Indian works concerned with the category Tathagata are also works that have something to say about its relationship to discourse about the self, or Atmavada. My hypothesis is that in our earliest works of this tradition, teaching about an immanent Buddha nature associated with the idea of Tathagata, or a hidden space for a Buddha, is presented as an account of the self. In these works, explicitly, the Buddha is teaching about selfhood. And this is found in works that Takasaki had relegated to the sidelines of this tradition. I think the Nirvana Sutra, Angulimalya Sutra, and Mahabharata Sutra are witnesses to the earliest life of this idea, presenting to audiences the Buddha's account of selfhood, plausibly to compete in an intellectual environment in which this was a still more important notion than it had been in earlier centuries. Evidence suggests that these sources were not, in and of themselves, well received in India. But the expression Tathagata, which could be used differently, was used further. In later texts, the term Tathagata is transformed, taken away from associations with discourse about selfhood, and which related to and then instead related to ideas about what supports our experience of transmigration and liberation. We find this in the Shamala Devi and Anunapa Aparanapa Nidesha. And then we have commentarial works that look back, I think, with some unease at Tathagata as once upon a time an account of the self. This is framed as something that the Buddha taught provisionally in need of further explanation. This idea is found in the Ratnagotavibhaga, and from the same period, late 4th or early 5th century, the Lankavatara Sutra. By tracing how these texts dealt with the relationship between, on the one hand, the idea of an enduring precious nature, and on the other, the fact that this is could be related to discourse about selfhood, I present a revised sense of the trajectory of teaching about Tathagata in India. I hold that this began as nothing less than the introduction, in one corner of the Mahayana, of something radical, an adoption after many centuries of a form of Buddhist Atmavada. But this did not prove popular. The term Tathagata, however, lived on in other works that wanted to preserve the sense of something immanent and enduring, but without the dubious association with discourse about selfhood, and the obvious clash with teaching about anatma. Maintaining due respect for the thoroughness of his work, in response to Takasaki, I would argue that the Atmavadin text of this literature, beginning with the Nirvana Sutra, are not a second current of this tradition that were ignored by the Ratnagotavibhaga. I think they are the early sources, an awkward heritage that was then eclipsed by the influence of works like the Shamala Devi. Today, I can only sketch out the central argument of my monograph. In the last few minutes, though, let me shift to what I've been looking at since. Other Indian Buddhist works, peripheral to those that I thought were most important in this story, that arguably hold further secrets about the early life of Buddha nature teaching. As I mentioned earlier, there's good reason to think that the Tathagata Sutra is not our earliest source regarding the term Tathagata. But what about the broader sense of what I called the Buddha nature idea? The idea that all sentient beings have already the quality or character of a Buddha. The central similes of the Tathagata Sutra, its earlier content, all present forms of Buddha nature type thinking. This is its core material, teaching that in all beings, there is either the Buddha's body or his knowledge or power residing in us already. Even if this is not the source for the term Tathagata, perhaps these similes of this text are traces of ideas early in the life of Buddha nature type thinking. These ideas are unsystematic or unrefined, but they are evocative, and they are the core of the Tathagata Sutra. Curiously, in another text that Takasaki studied, I found similar traces of something like this. Something like Buddha nature thinking, but without the term Tathagata. This is in a text that shares many doctrinal similarities with the Nirvana Sutra and has another fascinating textual history. This is the Mahamegha Sutra, or Great Cloud Sutra. And what is particularly exciting is that until recently, this is a work that was known only in its Chinese and Tibetan translations. Recently, though, what has come to light is a mostly complete Sanskrit manuscript. This is currently being edited and studied by Ye Xiaoyong and others at Peking University. And I'm grateful to Professor Ye for having provided some insights into the content of the Sanskrit manuscript. The Mahamegha Sutra is a text that Takasaki and other scholars did classify as a Tathagata work, but I have argued that that is unjustified. The text makes use of the term Tathagata just once, and it tells us nothing about what it means or to what it refers. In other words, some contributor to the Mahamegha Sutra knew the term Tathagata, but this was plausibly a late addition to the text and certainly not essential to what it was saying. But why did Takasaki and others consider it important? Answering this reminds us of an important dimension in the treatment of different witnesses to the life of an Indian work. The Chinese translation of the Mahamegha Sutra from the 5th century contains copious use of the Chinese Fuxing, which very often translated Buddha Dhatu and does mean something like Buddha nature. But there is a twist, because neither the Tibetan version nor extant Sanskrit of the text reflect any mention of the term Buddha Dhatu or anything like it. So why does the Chinese give us Fuxing? It looks like this Chinese version by Dharmakshema in the 5th century has been adapted into a text that is concerned with the term Fuxing, with Buddha nature. But I think this was an act by its translator, and not the best representation of what was present in an Indic version of the text, certainly not a literal translation. What we find in the corresponding Tibetan and now Sanskrit is quite fascinating. Here is just one very neat passage drawn from the Tibetan text. This is describing a particular meditative state that features throughout the Mahamegha Sutra. A bodhisattva who is established in this meditative state, this samadhi, has in himself the characteristics of a Buddha, we can tell from context. Hence, there is no basis for the emergence of a mind desirous of them. Look now, though, at the corresponding Chinese, which suggests terminology absent from our other witnesses. The Chinese gives us Fuxing, something that one can see within oneself, but there is no trace of this in the Tibetan, nor admittedly fragmentary extant Sanskrit. Evidence suggests that in this instance, the Chinese does not preserve the earlier form of the Mahamegha, but rather exhibits the ingenuity of a translator, adapting content in the direction of Buddha nature teaching. In the Tibetan, we find a bodhisattva realizing the qualities of a Buddha present within himself through a particular practice. What does this mean? The text reveres the transcendence and permanence of the Buddha. It refers to his qualities being made present in us all through certain practices. It does not seem to teach that these qualities are always there, but that the bodhisattva can make imminent, through meditative practice, the presence of the Buddha and his qualities. Now, this has none of the standard terminology of Buddha nature teaching, let alone use of the term Tathagata, but this is still reminiscent of it. There is no trace of any teachings about a pure mind or the ideas from a Yogacara Vijnanavada context, but something more nebulous, less doctrinally developed, plausibly early in the life of Mahayanist authors internalizing the qualities of a Buddha in all sentient beings. A task for scholarship going forward is to map out afresh the literary terrain around texts that talk about Tathagata, in light of more recent scholarship and, in some exciting cases, some new manuscript discoveries. The Mahamegha Sutra is just one relevant text, not quite a Tathagata work, but a sutra that still repeatedly talks about realizing the presence of a Buddha in the world and in ourselves. Another important work in this vein, about which I cannot speak further now, is the Sudama Pundarika, or Lotus Sutra, which is clearly an influence upon virtually every text that devotes any attention to the term Tathagata. Many of the most relevant places for us to look next have been identified already, in no small part by Takasaki and other venerable colleagues writing in the previous century. But it serves us to retrace our steps and to revisit texts and ideas that perhaps take on a new character if we consider them alongside other features of the classical Buddhist literary world, or indeed alongside other aspects of wider Indian religious and philosophical thinking, of Brahmanism, for example, in the early centuries CE. If colleagues are not persuaded by my new story about the evolution of the Tathagatagarbha literature, then what I still hope to have done is to draw attention to just how heterogeneous this tradition is and how doctrinally challenging some of its sources are. To many scholars of Buddhism, the dominant narrative about Buddha nature, especially in Tibetan tradition, relates to ideas about the pure character of the mind, informed, for example, by the Ratnabrata. In East Asia, Buddha nature is often entwined with the sophisticated metaphysics of works like the Cixin Lun, or Awakening of Faith. But what deserves still greater attention is the challenging prehistory to all of this. In Indian works that propose not only that all sentient beings have the nature of the Buddha, but that this can be considered what is important, most vital to ourselves, what the Buddha is supposed to have revealed as our true self. This dimension of Buddha nature teaching did not endure so much in Buddhist tradition, especially in India. This is clear enough, but it is worthy of consideration as a particularly colorful thread in the rich tapestry of Indian Buddhist doctrinal history. And with that, I thank you very much for your time.
And we can take 5 minutes.